Hey guys, so in today's video, I'm going to talk about how 2020 has been such a crazy year. It's been such a black swan event in recent history. I would say it's so significant. It's on par with historic events like the dissolution of the Soviet Union or the fall of the Berlin Wall or even September 11th in terms of the significance and the impact that it's having on society and on many aspects of life as we know it, right? So 2020 it has changed the world permanently in many ways. And going forward, there's going to be a lot of things that will work differently, and there will be a lot of new challenges that you as a millennial you have to get used to, you have to adapt to, and you have to prepare yourself for, right? And I'm talking about challenges in all aspects of life, whether it's career, business, it's money, or even personal safety and informational privacy and security, right? So all these things will become very prevalent challenges that we have to deal with. Okay, so the first and most obvious change that's happening already and is going to happen very rapidly all around us is that remote working is going to become the norm rather than the exception, and a lot more things will move online, right? So as you saw during the pandemic, everybody was forced to stay home. I think actually in a lot of Western countries now, people are still staying home. People have not fully returned to the office, right? So during this time, a lot of the tech companies have realized that working from home has not really had any significant effect on people's productivity or, the company's efficiency as a unit. So what they're doing now, coming out of the pandemic, is they're retaining this work from home structure. And a lot of tech companies such as Twitter or Square or Shopify maybe, I think they actually went 100% remote after this. They're not returning to the office. They're just going to be, a fully online digital team, people working from home, people working from everywhere, right? And I think this is going to be more and more common going forward, because not only is this good for employees because people are happy to have more freedom, more flexibility, to work from home, to work from the cafe, whatever, to be able to eat healthy at home, all these things. But also from the company's perspective, as long as there's a system that's in place which can allow teams to work effectively together, then in terms of the company, they're saving a lot of cost in terms of rent, office space, and all these things. So what this all means is that companies will now be able to hire talent from all over the world, right? There's no longer a physical and geographical barrier preventing companies from getting the best talent from Eastern Europe or India, Pakistan, or wherever, right? So if you're a developer, for example, if you're a programmer, you're now going to be facing competition from every single country out there, right? So you have to be sure that you're on top of your game. And also what's going to happen is the discrepancies in salaries will be less and less, right? Because if you're a really talented developer in Eastern Europe, there's no reason why you cannot get the same or similar salary as someone who's working in Silicon Valley if you're both working remotely, right? And what this will do also, it's most likely going to push more and more young people out of the big cities because it's too expensive to live in the big cities. There's no point to stay in a big city if you're if you're able to work from home, and there's no point to spend such high amounts of expenses on living, on rent, right? If you can move to a smaller city or to the countryside, you can do the same job, you can make the same money, but you can probably cut your expenses by half. So what this means is basically two things, right? So the first one is you have to be adaptable. You have to be open-minded and be willing to learn, because as everything is moving digitally online, there's so many new things coming out all the time, whether it's new information, data, or new tools being made every day. And you have to make an effort to be constantly learning and keeping up with all the developments, right? Maybe not all the developments, but whatever is relevant to you. Because like I said, now all the physical barriers are being removed when things are going online. So you can be working with customers all over the world, but you can also be competing with people all over the world, right? So you have to make an effort to keep up and to understand this new paradigm and what's happening. So the second thing, obviously, is you have to make the decision whether or not it's still worthwhile to live where you're living. If you live in a big city, for example, like if I'm working from home and I make $5,000 a month, but I'm living in San Francisco and paying $3,500 for rent, then makes absolutely zero sense. There's no way I would stay there, right? So yeah, that's a decision you have to make for yourself, whether or not it's worthwhile to pay so much money for the city life, which is probably not the same as what it used to be, or if it's better if you move to a smaller town, reduce your expenses, reduce your cost of living, and save more money that you can use to invest. So the next big change that I'm going to talk about is a bit more political. So what's been happening in 2020 obviously has been very tough for a lot of people, causing people a lot of grief or financial loss and all these things, right? And what happens when people are put into tough times is typically they will point their fingers at someone. They will find people to blame for their bad situations, right? And that's what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. For example, everybody was pointing their finger at China, perhaps rightly so. But there was a lot of hate and a lot of discrimination towards people of Asian descent. For example, in Australia, France, the UK, whatever, right? But now I think that sort of negativity virus has carried around to all aspects of society. You're seeing like nonstop blame games and fighting and rioting in the US. You're seeing people starting to get sort of restless in a lot of other countries as well, right? So there's sort of some noises being made. Some small revolutions and demonstrations being kicked up in other countries now as well. And another problem is because of the pandemic, most countries closed their borders, and now perhaps they're sort of getting used to this, right? So perhaps a lot of countries are realizing they're like, actually, we didn't really need all the open borders during globalization. Now they're kind of slow on reopening again. So this is a problem for people who like to travel, who like to utilize geo arbitrage, things like that. For the remainder of 2020 and perhaps even next year, it might be difficult to have the freedom and the flexibility to go anywhere we wanted as we did in 2019, right? So I think we kind of reached a maximum, a peak of globalization, open travel prior to coronavirus, and now after coronavirus, we've sort of taken a big dump in terms of the freedom to travel and globalization metrics, right? So I think for now, it's probably also a good time to just take it easy, find your base, and just sort of let time pass while you work on your craft and make money. Because also I think there's obviously, like I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of discrimination, xenophobia as well. So I think it's going to take time for this to pass, right? It's just like when September 11 happened, everybody was, super afraid of Muslims, for example. But then after a little while, life goes back to normal. And on a related note, thanks to this pandemic and all the hardships and economic crisis that a lot of people experienced, what we're experiencing now is an increasingly large wealth gap between the upper class and the middle and lower classes, right? So the middle class used to be sort of in the middle, but now it's much closer to the bottom, to the lower class rather than the upper class, right? So the 1%, the so-called 1% got a lot richer this year thanks to the stock market and real estate markets pumping like crazy despite absolutely no economic activity, right? So I mentioned earlier in my previous video talking about Bitcoin, about how the central banks are printing so much money to artificially prop up the markets, right? Meanwhile, people have no jobs, small business owners are out of business, but all the people at the top who own all of the assets, rich people have all the stocks and they have all the real estate, right? So their assets are appreciating more. They're actually getting richer this year, whereas the middle class and the poor people have nothing. They only have a little bit of cash maybe, or they're living paycheck to paycheck and suddenly their paycheck stopped. This enlarged wealth gap is really, really bad as well for society, for society balance, right? Because what's going to happen is more people will become bitter. And honestly, this is a contributor to what's happening in the United States right now with all the riots and social unrest, because people there's a lot of poor people, a lot of people who are in tough situations, and they're not happy with their lives, and they're looking for change, right? So this can be a problem because it can actually mean that, depending on where you live, your personal safety might be threatened, right? So this is also something to consider, not just this year, but possibly going forward as well, because I can't really imagine the wealth gap closing anytime soon. I think it's probably going to get worse and worse for the next couple of years, right? So if you live somewhere that's getting unsafe, then you should reconsider that as well, and possibly relocate to somewhere a bit more safer, or take appropriate measures to protect yourself and your family. And that could even mean relocating to a different country or moving abroad, right? So if you're a young guy with no family, not too much responsibility, that's definitely a viable option. Because for me personally, for example, I think in this decade, Asia is definitely going to be the most economically prosperous and the most safe continent to be. The US and Canada and the UK used to be sort of the golden standard for developed countries, right? But now, as you can see, if you live in some large cities in the US like Chicago or Seattle, Portland even, maybe it's not that safe anymore, right? So yeah, I mean, the world is changing, it's dynamic, it's changing all the time. Countries or dynasties or regions, they go up and down, right, in terms of their prosperity and safety and all these things. So if you feel that the physical environment you're in is not suitable for who you are, then maybe it's time to make a decision and move somewhere else. So another thing I want to talk about is how, I mentioned earlier how the central banks kept on printing money this year to artificially prop up the stock markets and to make sure that big companies don't go bankrupt, right? Meanwhile, a lot of smaller businesses and individuals have been basically financially destroyed, right? So all of this new money that's coming to the system it's not going to be good in the long term, because eventually it's going to have effects. It's going to cause inflation. It's going to make the average person, lose purchasing power, right? So you can check out my video where I talk about Bitcoin for that specific reason. And another thing is, after what happened this year, in order to deal with the crisis at first, a lot of countries had to start implementing more and more surveillance measures, right? Like contact tracing and, tracking where you've been, scanning QR codes everywhere, basically what's being done in China, but now a lot of other countries in the West even have started to implement that. This can be a slippery slope, because once governments realize they can do this easily and they have people's compliance, they'll just continue doing it. And then eventually they'll track more and more of your information, and there's going to be more and more informational surveillance and less privacy, right? So again, if you're a privacy conscious person, it may be a right time to start looking into things like cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin for financial privacy, but also for it may be time to start looking into VPNs and other cybersecurity measures to improve your digital privacy. So in summary, I firmly believe that 2020 has been a monumental year that's permanently changing the way things work in our world and around us. And you, as a millennial, you should be adaptable, you should be open-minded, and you should prepare yourself for the possibilities that are coming our way, right? So that means, if your job is going online and your company is going fully remote working, you should prepare for that possibility. You should be open-minded and constantly study, learn new things, and improve your digital skills. And also, of course, you should be aware of the aforementioned risks that I was talking about, right, in terms of monetary risk. So that's potentially inflation in the long term. So that's physical risk in terms of your personal safety, depending on where you live, and also informational risk. So in terms of privacy and surveillance and things like that. So you should understand that those risks are possible going forward, and you should prepare yourself accordingly, right? Whether that's buying some Bitcoin or investing in some precious metals, gold and silver, to guard against inflation, or investing in a property, or it's just migrating, relocating somewhere else that's safer or has a lower cost of living, and whatever makes sense, right? See you next time.